Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be with you here today. My name is Kristen Osling, and I'm with Plan International, and I'll be your moderator for today. We are just days away from when global leaders are going to be finalizing a climate finance goal that hopefully genuinely addresses the needs of those facing the greatest challenges in developing countries and communities bearing the greatest impacts of the climate crisis. And as we take stock on the ongoing negotiations, this session will provide a forum to explore creative and logical and sensible solutions to some of the remaining blocks. This includes ensuring a quantum that aligns with developing countries' needs. While all countries agree that the needs are in the trillions, there is not yet this has not yet been agreed to in the NCQG. There's also considerations of quality and how this quantum should break down in terms of private or public grants or loans, funding across mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. I'm really pleased that today's session and honored that it brings together climate finance experts with a huge range of perspectives. Our speakers have robust expertise on climate finance, and they all come with really different angles that are going to provide us with a fresh look and give us their insights on the solutions to some of the critical challenges that we're facing. We're going to be hearing about aligning finance with science, evidence, and needs, and considering different types of financing that is critical in the NCQG, as well as breaking down support for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And in terms of the process, our session today will have three parts. So first of all, we're going to set the scene with opening remarks. And then we're going to have a panel to dig deeper on the issues on the NCQG, and then it's going to be over to you for your questions from the audience. So, first of all, to set the scene, we have the pleasure of having and the honor of having with us today Ali Mohammed, Kenya's climate envoy. We also have Gloria Namakula from Uganda, and she's with the She Leads cohort. So first, let me turn to Ali Mohammed, Kenya's envoy. His expertise is going to set the scene today for our discussion by addressing the immense scale of financing required for developing countries. And he's going to explore a number of innovative finance areas, including solidarity levies and public financing that can support these needs, which are really pivotal to meeting the NCQG goals. So without further ado, uh, thank you very much, Mohammed. And if you could, Ali Mohammed, if you could begin with your presentation. I know that we have a deck for you, and I'm going to advance the slides. Right? Do you have slides?
Well, I didn't send, but maybe my team has sent. Sure. Don't think there is a
No?
unless this one. But anyway, good afternoon, colleagues and friends, and it's so good to be in a room with so many people who are contributing to us, not in the negotiation rooms, but contributing to the knowledge base of all these discussions of climate. The civil society organizations have a critical role to play and help us as party negotiators, to help us with the data and the information that is required to help us arrive at a reasonable outcome for the COP. As you had, in addition to the role that the moderator mentioned, I'm also privileged to be chairing the African group currently. And Africa group has been very forward-leaning when it comes to matters on NCQG. And our ministers of environment and climate and planning have had several meetings prior to Baku, and we have made presentations on the whole need for the world, really, and of course Africa part of it on the NCQG. And starting with the NCQG, of course, I'm sure you are all aware where the state of play currently. There's been a firm position by the G77 and China. We, at least so far, we are as one bloc having one position, and we had to request a representation of the old text that was presented on 15th of last month. There's a new one that was presented. I think some discussions going on. Streamlining was requested, but probably are aware to streamline from 35 to 34, and a good attempt by the co-chairs by removing one page. But the issues are still as wide as they were in the first place. So, what is the asks from the African group? One, we start with the quantum, because the mandate that we have from Paris was really on quantum, new collective quantified goal. So as the African group, we've been pushing for a quantum of $1.3 trillion every year between now and 2030. And as we all know, these are figures that fall within several reports. Earlier on, we received the independent high-level group in Dubai, but also the needs assessment reports that the Standing Committee on Finance, SCF, gave us, the first report of needs determination, and the second report, so it was between 5 and 6 trillion. And the second one, you all know, was around 5 billion. So it fits within there. But there are many other reports. For the case of Africa, the UN Economic Commission for Africa did carry out some quick assessment of how much was the costed needs for the NDCs of 51 countries out of 54 and the NAPs. And the figure that we got was $2.8 trillion. So the 1.3 trillion is on the basis of a number of assessments that were done by UN and other independent sources. So that is what the African group has been pushing. With regard to structure, which is, of course, a very contentious issue, as we all know, the structure, we are of the view that the structure is clearly provided for under the Article 9. And so that's already stratified under the article, and we are emphasizing that let's be faithful to the structure as it is. And of course, what is the funding for? It's supposed to be outcome based to help us deliver on all the decisions that we've reached from Dubai, Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation, and our current NDCs and our next NDCs, because as you know from Dubai, there was the agreement to go to the next NDCs. So it should be outcome based, supporting developing countries to implement the already agreed outcomes. And of course, where should the money come from is another big contentious issue. And I'm sure all of you as experts in this field, you know the contentions currently, what's the source of the money. And of course, we are referring back to the convention and the Paris to guide us on this. And so Article 4 and of the convention and 9 of the Paris Agreement, are very clear. The leadership, must be provided by developed countries, and developed countries should be the ones who are raising this support. And it should have a core of public finance, because it's about provisioning and mobilization, but the core really must be sourced from public finance. With regard to temporal scope, again, the Africa's position is, given that we've already agreed on the cycle of NDCs, then 5-year cycle should also be this one. So we're saying between now and 2030, and so it should be a 5-year cycle. But of course, with regard to the main thing for us as Africa is the systemic issues. The challenge for many of us in the African continent is access to finance. And the access is not in terms of development of or preparation of project development and so forth. It is actually accessing finance, the cost of the capital. So the biggest challenge is most of us in Africa have to access finance at 5 to 8% of what others are accessing, and that directly disadvantages us on being able to make the necessary impacts. That is another important issue for us with regard to systemic issues. Many African countries, 23 in number, are currently in debt distress or high debt distress situation. About 4 African countries, I'm sure you're aware, have already defaulted, and several are just on the cliffs about to default. And so without addressing those systemic issues also with regard to the quality of the quantum, it may not be impactful as we wish to see it. So we are emphasizing the qualitative aspects as much as also emphasizing the quantitative aspects. So those are the things that we are currently pushing as Africa, and of course from Sharm el-Sheikh to Dubai, and now the whole issue requires therefore signaling and strong messaging for reforms of international financial architecture. There is good attempt that is happening, as we all know. Maybe I should not say good, but at least there is an effort towards that by the MDBs. And so we've been given a 3rd seat in the IMF board, and I think there was debt force clauses that was agreed to by the bank. But I think there is much more that needs really to be done with regard to the reform of international financial architecture. Capitalization of the MDBs, much more capitalization, so that they can leverage more financing is a critical issue. So that is the state of play and what Africa is. And we're not far from the other developing countries, because as I said earlier, G77 is uniform on this issue so far. We are all together on the matter, and we are pushing. And of course, burden sharing is critical with regard to responsibility. So it is important that the developed world has clear burden sharing mechanism, so that it's not just blanket to say so much has been mobilized by whom, we don't know, for what, in what form. So a clear burden sharing, to be guided by the transparency and accountability frameworks. That is where we are as on the negotiations. Because the moderator made reference to the issue of innovative financing, and now that is not Africa, this is now Kenya specifically. President Ruto, President Macron, and Prime Minister Mia Mottley last year in Dubai launched an initiative, at the time we call it task force on innovative task force on levies, to look at where should finance be coming from. Over the year, last year we have, this year rather, we renamed it. We call it Solidarity Levies Task Force, where the ECF, European Climate Foundation, and another foundation in Africa are co-leading. And we have experts, independent experts, to help us look at opportunities and possibilities of innovative financing. And of course, you know that there's been a lot of discussion in the maritime levies possibility, in the issue of aviation levies, on financial transactions levies, and fossil fuel as well. There is a good report. We have since expanded from 3, we are now 21 countries. And we are reaching out to many more countries. I think 2 days ago, we had a meeting here where a number of global leaders participated. Madam Prime Minister Mottley, the Prime Minister of Spain, the UN Secretary General, the President of Marshall Islands, and many, many ministers and senior officials from around the world. You know, so the solidarity team is expanding, and we want to see more, you know, coalition of the willing, so that we can see how we can contribute and input even in the global discussions on new collective quantified goal, because we must look at all possibilities, all sources of financing, and that is getting some traction, as I said, both from developed and developing. In the last meeting, I think we had 5 African countries have joined. And as I said, Ireland, Spain, and several other European countries and Latin American countries. We've reached out to Brazil, and I think very soon Brazil will also join. Colombia, of course, is already a member from Latin America, and so forth. So we're trying to expand that so that there is many more countries, you know, looking at wider possibilities of raising financing, because raising financing is not the easiest of things, especially when there's so much global geopolitics going around. So I'll leave it at that for now, and thank you very much for inviting me here.
Wow, thank you so much for those insights. And I do agree that we definitely need a coalition of the willing and all around the world, that we need solidarity to really bring the quantum that we need. Thank you so much, Ali Mohammed, for setting the scene for us. Our next scene setter is Gloria Namakula, and I think you'd like to come up to the podium. I'm going to introduce you. Gloria is part of the She Leads Climate cohort, and she's based in Uganda. The climate cohort, She Leads Climate cohort, is a group of young women and girls working on climate justice advocacy. And Gloria's advocacy journey started in 2019 after her family and community faced the effects of a prolonged drought caused by the impact of climate change in Uganda. And this lived experience ignited her climate change advocacy journey. She is driven by the desire to find solutions to help her family and community tackle the adverse effects of climate change. And Gloria is going to share with us a critical intergenerational perspective on climate finance. This input is going to remind us that the decisions we make today affect future generations, framing our commitment to climate resilience and inclusivity in the long term. Gloria intends to use COP29 to advocate for gender responsive climate funding, meaningful inclusion of youth, especially girls and young women, in climate related decisions. Now over to you, Gloria.
Thank you very much. Hello. Hi. It's my. Yeah. Can you get me? Yeah. Hello. I just prefer to see the room a little bit lively, you know. You're all in a somber mood. Can we make it lively? Because in the long run, we're looking at change. We want to ensure that the sad stories we have hope at the end of the day. Well, I'll be giving a setting. So my name is Gloria, as I've already been introduced, and I have a written speech that I will deliver. So, honorable delegates, esteemed leaders, fellow youth climate advocates, ladies and gentlemen, warm greeting to you all. I stand before you today as a girl and young woman advocate from the She Leads Climate Change cohort in Uganda, representing voices of millions of girls and young women from vulnerable yet fragile communities who suffer the brunt of climate change daily, coupled with lost hope. My name is Gloria. I was born, raised, and have studied in a small, fragile village near the source of Lake Victoria, that is River Nile. Over the years, floods, erratic rainfalls, heavy storms, prolonged droughts have made life so difficult, especially for girls and young women, because because of the work we have to do, like it is in an African setting, whereby it is the girls and young women who do the stewardship, who do the caretaking roles at home. So when climate change comes on board, it really makes it very difficult for us. And this is later on coupled with poverty. And this poverty has been caused because of climate change. You realize the countries where we come from, like Uganda, we mainly do agriculture. Agriculture is the source of livelihood. And when we talk about climate change really affects our livelihood. And you know what it means without livelihood. So in my village, 10 out of 10 people have never heard about climate change, or they even don't understand what climate change means. And later on, we bring in the concept of climate finance. They really don't understand. Most people don't understand why their crops are not growing. They don't understand why their cattle is dying. They really don't understand why do they need to walk long hours to fetch water. They really don't understand why they don't have support for their children to go to school. And yet all this is attributed to what? To climate change. There is no support to adapt climate change, how to prepare for a new climate finance. If only the polluters who created this nightmare for us would be fair enough and pay the price in terms of investing in climate education, preparing our communities for the climate shock, that would be fair enough. This would ensure that we do not become more poorer. We, girls and young women, no longer face gender-based violence. Girls and young women will no longer be subjected to sexual harassment. Girls and young women will no longer be subjected to not going to school. However, this can never be done because there is no funding. There is no change that can be made without funding. So my prayer here is it's time to act. We ought to act now. We face a lot of climate effects. I'm just giving a brief because of time. I would really do a lot when it comes to that. So basically, ladies and gentlemen, as we gather here at the critical moment for the last push for an ambitious and equitable new collective quantified goal on climate finance, meeting the needs of developing countries, I urge you to remember what is happening. What is happening at the grassroots? It's high time we had honest conversations and ensure that climate change is not an injustice, because really climate change has disappropriately affected girls and young women. And without substantial funding committed to the new collective quantified goal, we will remain very deprived of our rights, and many of our futures will be more uncertain. So as a victim of climate crisis and as a visionary leader and the other group of the millions of girls and young women I'm representing, our demand is, or our prayer is, one, increased funding for climate adaptation for our vulnerable communities. We want grants. We want grants, not loans, because the debt trap is real. The debt burden is real, and it has indeed become a nightmare. The previous speakers talked about debt, the debt burden, the debt trap, because ideally our governments can no longer do anything, given the fact that they really have to finance the debts on behalf or at the extent of our rights or our social needs that we really need. So at least this shouldn't be, it should be a bare minimum or a minimum compensation for the loss and damage, given that the recent, the everyday things we go through, so that we can really try to champion and cause the change. Secondly is we demand strong commitments and much more accessible and flexible funding to reduce global warming and greenhouse effects, especially from the biggest polluters, as they are the most responsible for climate change and its effects on girls and young women, which also means that the loss and damage must be part of the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. Thirdly, we demand inclusive, meaningful participation of girls and young women in decision-making processes as we amplify our voices in line with our specific needs and solutions. Because trust me, we have the needs and we have the solutions. Just put us in place where we can amplify our voices to cause the change that we want to see. And as I go to the world leaders in the building, our request is we ask you to ensure equal access to climate finance for girls and young women in vulnerable regions and ensure that the new collective quantified goal on climate finance integrates our needs. It is very crucial. Our perspectives and solutions in line with climate finance processes, policies, and actions, because I want to assure you, people at the grassroots, they don't know the processes. We are talking about climate finance. They don't know what it takes, how climate finance can be gotten. What process do they need? How can a girl and young woman have access to this? We really need to ensure that from the discussion we are having today, that we privilege on that and ensure that there is equal access and flexible funding getting to the grassroots and ensure that all our solutions are fronted and we tackle the needs we face. Secondly, we ask to be accountable and structure funding for the action for climate empowerment. Because as I'm standing here, basically what I do at the grassroots is action for climate empowerment. We are trying our level best to ensure that we raise voices and inform the society that this is happening and this is happening because of this, and these are the solutions we really need to put on board. This action for climate empowerment should include climate education, training, public awareness, and meaningful participation of girls and young women in climate change processes, from decision making to funding and from implementation to monitoring processes. Because in my community, I still see a lot of people don't understand what climate change means. What causes the climate change? Why are we suffering? They really don't understand. You find in the long run, they attribute it to culture norms, the rigid culture norms. Maybe it's the culture norms. And yet, all of us in this room, we really understand where climate change comes from and what causes the climate change. Lastly, we want to see a future where the needs and solutions of girls and young women in their diversity are integrated in climate policies, where girls and young women from the global south have access to climate finance to finance their solutions, a future where girls are not married under 18. We want to see a future where teenage pregnancy is no longer an issue. We want to see an issue. We want to see a future where migration is not the order of the day. We want to see a future where gender-based violence is not an everyday thing, because it is really happening at the grassroots. We want girls attending schools even after the climate crisis is. I beg you all and I request you that let's rise to this moment. Let's choose equity over exploitation. And without ambitious financial commitments for the developed countries at COP29, the futures of young people, especially girls and young women, will remain compromised. Countries need to agree on a bold climate finance now. So that generations now and the generations to come will never suffer the effects of climate finance. Thank you all for listening.
Wow, thank you so much. Gloria, that is very powerful. And I think it really puts it into context for all of us. This is the lived experience of people, of uh, young children and young women in developing countries that are living in the climate crisis. And we need to ensure that their voices are heard. And I really, really appreciate your recommendations. And again, welcome to the Coalition of the Willing on the NCQG, Gloria. We're going to now turn to our panel discussion. And we have on our panel, we have 3 speakers. And we're gonna start right now with Dr. Noreen. She's our first panelist. Uh, Dr. Noreen brings firsthand insights from Pakistan, a country facing severe climate impacts. And that's despite, of course, minimal contributions to global emissions. Dr. Noreen has held Mercy Corps' response, she's led Mercy Corps' response to Pakistan in 2022 during the monsoon floods. And this is a testament to her expertise in emergency response. Her perspective underscores the importance of grant-based funding for loss and damage within the NCQG framework. Now over to you, Noreen.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here today among all of you and to be talking to all of you. And I'm sorry I got in with a little bit of delay. My apologies for that. 2 years ago, as Pakistan, major parts of the country were inundated and submerged in water, with millions of people that were displaced, women, men, children, elderly among them, living in temporary shelters with their livelihoods and their homes gone. I had the opportunity to be at COP27 and talk about the disaster of immense magnitude that the country had faced. 2 years on, we know what happened post 2022 floods in Pakistan, and I'll talk about that a little bit. The 2022 floods of Pakistan impacted over 33 million people. Millions of people were displaced after losing their homes, their assets, their livelihoods, their lives, facing serious health risks, lacking access to food and water, clean drinking water, hygiene, access to schools. The country estimated to have lost, let me see. At that time, the country had estimated to have lost roughly $15 billion in damages, an equal amount in economic losses, and a greater amount that was needed for relief and recovery. Pakistan is among the top 10 countries that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The country of over 240 million population is beset with socio-economic challenges that make a large population disproportionately affected and vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Whereas, let me remind you, the country has contributed minimally to the global emissions. The frequent climate-related disasters have had a huge impact and huge economic toll on the country, which loses billions of dollars every year due to climate-induced disasters. This directly impacts Pakistan's development progress, as well as longer-term growth. The 2022 floods alone exerted a drag of 8% losses on the GDP and pushed another estimated 9 million women, men, and children below the national poverty line. Alongside the financial burden of recovery from the impacts of climate change strains Pakistan's limited resources, Pakistan has contributed less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, yet the financial strain caused by climate-induced disasters is huge, limiting the government's ability to invest in critical infrastructure, in healthcare, for example, also in their adaptation plans and adaptation measures, creating a vicious cycle of vulnerability. I'll now talk a little bit about how the relief and recovery post 2022 floods was funded in Pakistan. As I mentioned at the time, an estimate of 16.3 billion US dollars was made for relief and recovery efforts. And I believe it was in January 2023 that the government held a conference in Geneva where various governments and donors made their pledges. At that time, pledges of about $11 billion were made, falling short of the estimated need at that time. And even at that time, it was known that 90% of those funds will come in the form of loans. 2 years on, about 1/3 of the pledged amount has been disbursed to the country, majority of it in loans, and in most cases, loans that have been repurposed from existing projects. Now, the disbursement of about 3 billion US dollars, about 1/3 of the pledged amount, has contributed some to the recovery efforts, but that is very little compared to the need, has led to an increase in the debt burden of the country without fully meeting the needs of the population. And thus, the country remains in a continuous cycle of trying to recover from a major disaster while encountering new climate events every year. What happens when the funding that is required is not made available? Today, millions of people, 12 million, have been reported that remain displaced or under temporary shelters 2 years since the disaster, basically fending for themselves. And like I said, facing further climate disasters such as more flooding that happened this year in 2024, as well as heat waves. Beyond recovery and relief, Pakistan also needs to prioritize adaptation and resilience, given the growing and cross-cutting challenges posed by climate change. The country needs to embed adaptation strategies in its development and planning frameworks so that it can make progress towards longer-term development, can reduce economic losses, and pursue sustainable development. Pakistan has updated its NDC back in 2021 and will review again in 2025. But that NDC has an ambitious target of 50% reduction in emissions by 2030, but that's conditional to receiving international grant funding. Pakistan's National Adaptation Plan also provides a framework for implementing adaptation with inclusiveness, bringing and facilitating collaboration between partners and stakeholders, and it can serve as an effective tool for climate finance. The NAP shows, the National Adaptation Plan of Pakistan, shows that the country needs to invest about $152 billion in adaptation and around $200 billion in mitigation. That makes 10.7% of the country's GDP annually. This is an immense. It's a huge figure. It is an enormous figure, especially when we compare it to the historic average annual development budget of the country at federal and provincial levels. Also in the NAP, we see that the private sector investments, whatever are coming from households and corporations or financial institutions, they're accounted towards mitigation, falling short of the need on that account as well. But that also shows that the adaptation and loss and damage are severely underfunded in the country. Finally, I have 3 key messages based on the case study of Pakistan. First of all, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities dictates that developed countries must provide climate finance to support the developing countries in coping with the impacts of a crisis that was not of their making. Such climate finance must come as grant-based funding. Grants are particularly important because adaptation and loss and damage are areas which are not attractive for private sector financing. This is a matter of climate justice, that is clear, but it is also something that will work, the only thing that will work. For countries such as Pakistan, vulnerable countries such as Pakistan, we know that anything, any funding which is not proportionate to the needs and which is not coming, which is tied in loans, not coming as grants, is something that has not worked and it is not going to work. So that really is one key message from everything that we have seen in Pakistan from the 2022 floods and the response thereafter. Pakistan and similar vulnerable countries need to urgently build their long-term resilience to climate disasters. And these countries continually find themselves in a cycle of relief and recovery, gravely impacting their longer-term development and resilience. So the grant-based funding for adaptation and loss and damage. The second key message is, it's a short one. The quantum of the new collective quantifiable goal must be proportionate to the need. And that's all I'll say about that. The third key message is that the NCQG must include loss and damage. At the last COP, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage was created. Such a welcome step. It is now essential to make sure that the fund is, the money flows into and from the fund to the vulnerable countries. Including loss and damage in NCQG will ensure that the funding remains available, that the fund remains filled. If NCQG does not include loss and damage alongside adaptation and mitigation, the gains made at COP28 would be lost. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Farah Noreen. I'm really struck by what you said about what happens if we don't get the money. And it's clear that with climate disasters increasing every year, that we need these funds in order to both build resilience and also really get ourselves to another place other than climate crisis. I'd like to turn now to Leticia, Dr. Leticia Pettinotti. She is a research fellow with ODI. She's a climate economist and research fellow, and she's done extensive research on economic transformation and climate inclusion. And we're really, really happy to have you here today to give us insights into how ambitious financing targets can really support adaptation and mitigation. And Leticia will share key findings from ODI's latest report and recommendations to ensure that the NCQG addresses both the scale and the quality in funding that's needed. So over to you.
Okay, where am I supposed to point? Okay, so there may be a bit of a time lag, but hopefully you will have the slides because I have a few figures to present. But oh, thank you very much. So I can start. So thank you very much. I am Leticia. I work at ODI, and I'm going to present on behalf of the team. And to the question as to what an ambitious NCQG mean, I'd like to unpack this a little bit. If you can go to the next slide, please. Because reflecting on what it actually means, I think we can think about it in three aspects. One is an NCQG that would be ambitious, would be reflecting the urgency. And that's the urgency when we're facing a crisis on this scale, as Gloria was describing, as Farah was describing. So it needs to reflect this urgency. The second point would be about the clarity. An ambitious NCQG would have clarity as to who is contributing, how much, for whom. So we need this clarity for accountability. And the third point is that an ambitious NCQG would act as a springboard for further collaboration, so that it can then launch further collaboration, because we cannot have everything in the NCQG either, because this is under the mandate of the convention. So in this presentation, I will focus on one element of what clarity could mean, and that is clarity regarding the collective aspects of the NCQG. Next slide, please. Apologies, I'll have to say next slide every time. So this is the report that the co-chairs to the NCQG published a few months ago, because I want to explain what we call the collective aspects, right? Because the NCQG is supposed to be a collective. What are they? And they defined it as burden sharing or broadening the contributors base. These are the collective aspects of implementation of the new climate finance goal. So these, I'm gonna cover both. I'm gonna start with the burden sharing. So burden sharing, next slide, please, is basically the idea that if we can apportion how much each developed country is supposed to contribute to the new climate finance goal, we can bypass the issue that we had with the 100 billion goal. So if you remember, this goal was very vague because it was referring to a collective of developed countries that would jointly mobilize 100 billion, which meant that we couldn't hold countries accountable on an individual basis, meaning that when one country was saying we are contributing our fair share, we have contributed X billion, we just had to take their words for it. So what we want to do is to provide this individual per country accountability, so that, you know, we diminish this sort of hiding behind each other that countries, developed countries may have played in the past of, well, we've contributed enough. And it also helps, you know, having a more nuanced implementation of the CBDRRC principle that Farah was mentioning, in the sense that there is also a large heterogeneity between developed countries. And I'll come back to that one. So next slide, please. And burden sharing is nothing new in the sense that it has been mentioned under the convention a couple of times. So this is excerpts from Article 4.3 in the convention that relates to the financial resources. And we have the mention, the emphasis is mine, but of the importance of appropriate burden sharing among the developed country parties. And again, at the COP in Marrakesh, there was in decision text, there was again a mention of appropriate modalities for burden sharing, and again designating Annex 2 countries, so the so-called developed countries. So it's nothing new in the sense that this is a concept, an idea that has been mentioned before in our discussion under the convention. And it is also something that we have seen in other forums, in other governance bodies. So, for example, under NATO, there is a burden sharing agreement of how much each country should contribute according to their GNI. There is one, of course, within the UN. This is based, again, on the GNI of each country that is part of the UN. There was actually also one under the Kyoto Protocol. So the EU decided to have a joint responsibility towards the Kyoto mitigation target, and they adopted a burden sharing mechanism for the EU country that was negotiated with among the EU countries. So it's nothing new, and actually the language in previous NCQG documents that came out about a month ago does mention burden sharing, but it still raises a few questions. So in that paragraph 21, it does ask the question of what units should be used. So it says, based on historical emissions. So how do you count for the emissions? Are we talking CO2 only? Are we talking all GHG? This is important because methane has a large global warming potential, and it's related to land use changes. So it does matter which GHG is included. It's also about the measurement unit. So are we talking about territorial emissions? Are we talking about consumption emissions? Are we reattributing emissions that occurred during colonization? So these are all questions that are really important. And also, what source should we use? Do we use the emission that each country reports to the UNFCCC, or do we use an independent source for this data? So what I mean by raising all these questions is that there is a lot more work to do, even if we get this language in. And there is also the starting point for what are historical emissions, right? Do we start with a scientific starting point of 1850? Because we know that that's when climate change sort of the accumulation started. Or do we start in the 1990s, which is a more political baseline that has already been agreed under the convention? So perhaps an easier game because there is already consensus. So what ODI has done, and I really want to stress, this is one example of a burden sharing arrangement, and every indicator should be subject to negotiations. This is about parties having an agreement around these indicators, because as I raised in the previous slides, the units do matter and it can change a lot in terms of the results. And we present this one, but other research think tanks have also developed other WRI, for example, ETH, Zurich, CGDev. So please have a look. Don't take our word for it. But what we have done is basically develop an index so that we can attribute a proportion of climate finance to each developed country. So how much should each be contributing based on historic responsibility? We've taken CO2 since 1990. Capacity to pay, we've taken GNI, and population, which is GNI, and each, which is population, sorry. That one is an easy one. And basically each variable speaks to different understanding of fairness, right? So that's why I say this is about negotiations. So the next slide will show you what it looks like. So when I was saying that it also helps having a more nuanced representation and heterogeneity between developed countries, this is what I'm talking about, because United States is a big chunk in the middle, 45% of responsibility of whatever goal is adopted, whereas at the other end of the spectrum, you have Iceland at 0.04%. So the next slide is going to show you, that's just calling out our min and max. So these are the results of this fair share index for the climate finance that was provided by developed countries in 2022. So we have computed the data so that we can compare how much was contributed and how much does that bring the country closer to having paid its fair share of climate finance. And what we have is that actually almost half of developed countries have not contributed what they should have done, what they should have. But when we have a closer look at those that haven't paid their fair share, there are huge discrepancies, right? Because you look at the US, they should have actually paid 30 billion more. Australia, about 1.6 more. And then we have the UK, Canada, Italy, about 1 billion more. So this is just an illustration that if we do adopt a burden sharing arrangement, that means we have the tools to hold these countries accountable every single year when they do their reporting. We can then cross-compare and say, this is enough, this is matching your responsibility, or this isn't. So in the next slide, please, I will cover the collective aspect, I believe that is the next slide, that relates to the contributor base. So why have, next slide, please. Why have a contributor base, an expansion of the contributor base? Well, the same way that developing countries have been calling for a burden sharing arrangement, developed countries have been calling for an expansion of the contributor base. And that is because, well, countries' emissions have changed. Income vulnerability profiles have all changed since 1992 when the annexes were adopted. Okay. However, I think it's a really important principle that this should be done according to national circumstances and in line with the spirit of the Paris Agreement, which is about self-determination. So yes, it could bring a more nuanced differentiation among developing countries, but I think that the first thing to say in the next slide the one back, is that it is at the moment, so this is the last public document on the NCQG, that it was raised, this question of how should this new expanded contributor base should be determined. Should it be self-led in the sense that contributors assess where they are at and decide according to their own national circumstances whether they want to officially contribute, or should it be criteria-led? So meaning that there are set criteria that countries have adopted, and if you meet them, then you're part of the pool that should be contributing. And I think that to start off this conversation, it's really important to recognize that actually developing countries have been contributing climate finance. In the next slide, you will see the top 30 climate finance contributors. So in blue, you have developing countries contribution, and this is only multilateral contribution. So that means that it does not include bilateral contribution. So in this comparison, developing countries, climate finance is an underestimate. So you have China, that's among the top, and then you have India, Brazil, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's really important to say that these countries do contribute climate finance, but they don't necessarily report on it. And I think that's where the debate should be reframed. In the next slide, I just want to give, great, thank you. If we would like to think about when would be the moment for developing countries to assess their own national circumstances, we just want to highlight that they could think about it in the sense of, have they come at the same level in terms of GNI per capita GNI and per capita cumulative territorial CO2 emissions? Are they on par with Annex 2? So you see here a few countries that are highlighted because either they're SIDS and very vulnerable countries as under the convention, or ones that are very vulnerable as per a vulnerability index by Notre Dame University. So the one that I think you should focus on are really the one on the top right corner. And let's see if that animation works if you go to the next slide, because they are, so Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, and South Korea. And you may remember that South Korea and Kuwait were among the top 30 developing countries that were contributing climate finance. So again, and that's my next slide, and thank you for going through with me on these, like at times a bit technical points, but it is important that we do already think through what are the details, what are the technicalities that when linked to a quantum can indeed help us define what is an ambitious NCQG. And that would be reflecting the urgency, having clarity, and ensuring that it can help us be a launch pad for further cooperation. Thank you.
Dr. Pettinotti, thank you so much for bringing clarity on the question of who pays and bringing this very evidence-based approach and with the value of fairness all across and illustrating this for us so brilliantly. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn now to our final panelist. We're very pleased to have with us today Igor Paunovic. He's a senior economist with UNCTAD, and at UNCTAD, Igor Paunovic is chief of the Climate and Development Strategy Unit. He works on issues related to global governance, climate change, and development strategies, industrial as well as fiscal policy. He focuses also on South-South cooperation and regional integration. He is the co-author of a recently published research report on the NCQG, and he's going to lay out some of the key issues. We're diving even deeper now into the NCQG. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Can you put the thanks? So you can see the report here, and it's available on the web page of UNCTAD. UNCTAD is United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. That's the UN arm dealing with or part of the UN, which deals with trade and development now for 60 years. It was formed in 1964. So this year we had the 60th anniversary. This is just an introduction for those of you who are not familiar with UNCTAD. Why am I saying that? The unit I'm heading right now was formed 2 years ago because we realized that actually the climate crowd and development crowds are not talking to each other. And there is a pretty big gap between the two. And given what is happening in the world right now, we really cannot afford to have these two crowds separate and not talking to each other and not understanding each other. So that's the reason why we formed this. It's a relatively small unit, but we are trying to really push hard to bring development perspective to climate issues and also to development issues to introduce climate considerations, because our starting point is that we now live in a climate constrained world, meaning that what was possible only 10, 20 years ago, like Chinese miracle, for example, is no longer possible for other developing countries. If we just imagine the rest of the developing world to grow by 10% on the basis of fossil fuel energy, we are going to have 4 or 5 degrees by the end of this century. Just hypothetical case. But exactly for that reason, we need a new development model which will lead everybody to the climate resilient, sustainable development. And actually, climate resilient development is, in my opinion, the key word or concept in the Paris Agreement. So next slide. In that vein and in that line of thinking, we also recognized the importance of the NCQG, and we wanted to bring some clarity from the economic and development perspective to it. So we estimated the NCQG needs based on the macroeconomic analysis on the UN global policy model that is based in UNCTAD and that we use for trade and development report, our flagship report that is published every year. And I invite you to look at these reports. They do bring quite a lot of interesting stuff. Every year there is a different topic emphasizing different challenges of developing countries, but also the analysis of the current state of the global economy. So why a macroeconomic analysis? If we just take the needs of the countries and put them together, piling up, we do not actually provide the realistic view of what is actually possible from the macroeconomic point of view, because the global economy is a system that functions interdependently. What is happening in developing countries is important for developed countries and vice versa. Just a very brief example, if the interest rates in the US go up, the rest of the world is also affected, and you know that. And with the COVID price increases and the increase of Fed's interest rate, very fast increase to around 5%, many developing countries actually saw their debt servicing skyrocketing. So for that reason, you need to have a macroeconomic analysis, ideally a model, to actually see what is possible. So that's the reason why we used macroeconomic analysis. And we are comparing scenarios for the future, base scenario, business as usual, as this economy, global economy is going right now, and the best case scenario. So we derive from that a projected funding which is needed for investment. And based on our analysis, in 2025, developing countries would require around 1.1 trillion for climate finance, and this is rising to 1.8 trillion by the end of this decade. Of course, the global economy is increasing, but also the needs are increasing in developing countries, both for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Then we calculate what is possible to mobilize from domestic resources. And we basically find out that up to 25% of that amount can be mobilized internally, but not more than that. And this is important because other analyses which were not based on modeling are saying developing countries should come up with half of the needs. This is Song-Western. If developing countries try to do that, they would have to go very deeply into debt. And already we know that many developing countries are on the verge of debt distress or already in debt distress. And then we calculate the NCQG target. Next. So I will skip this one, the next one, because it's more detailed and it gives you the results from the which are in our report. The next one, please. So this is the increase from additional required investment for adaptation and mitigation. And the next one, the table actually shows that investment needs for adaptation and mitigation in developing countries are around 950 billion in 2025. I'll just go through the numbers so that you get the idea. And then what is possible from the domestic resource mobilization is 220 billion. So external financing needs for adaptation and mitigation would be 736 billion. And we estimated that around 150 billion would be the minimum support for loss and damage, which gives us something around 900 billion for NCQG. So we are saying if developing countries can contribute by 25% of this amount, NCQG, or the external part coming from the developed countries, should be 75%, around 900 billion. Next, please. This is basically 1.4% of GDP of developed countries. Is it big number? Yes, it is a big number. But when we compare it to other major expenditures, both historically and contemporary, it actually is not a big number. The Marshall Plan of the US provided 1.3% of the US GDP for 4 years to rebuild 16 countries in Western Europe after the Second World War. The military expenditure of NATO countries, and we use NATO as a proxy for developed countries, is 1.9% of their GDP every year. Total fossil fuel subsidies in developed countries are 3.6% of their GDP. And the fiscal response to COVID crisis in developed countries was 16.4% of GDP in 1 year. So it is possible to mobilize more than 16% of additional resources in just 1 year when there is a political will. Next one. Just a little bit on the private sector role. There's much emphasis on the private sector, but let me just concentrate on how much the private sector mobilized to the 100 billion goal, the old goal. In 2022, private sector mobilized 19% of the total. In the 6 years before 2022, the average share of private finance mobilization was around 17.5. So 20% is an ambitious but reasonable assumptions for what could be mobilized from the private sector. Next one. So it means that of the total, this would imply 20% would imply 177 billion, what we can expect from the private sector, and 700 billion to come from public financing. But the current stance of developed countries is actually the other way around. Not 20% private sector, 80% public, but they are saying we can go up to 200 billion or something like that, which is 20% of the needs, and 80% will come from multi-layered approach. We don't think that's possible, that's realistic on the trends that we had in the last 5-6 years. Next one. We also have something on quality, actually around 10 pages. Next one. Here are the principles, and we already heard a little bit about that, but you can see that in the report. And the last one, please. The main messages are the quantum needs to be based on developing country needs, which are around 2% of their GDP, or 1%, 1.4% of GDP of developed countries. Quality also matters. Principles should guide the NCQG ex ante and be used to assess the outcome ex post. Private sector can play a supporting role, but cannot be the main actor. And I think that coming from the economic analysis really underscores the point that the current position is not sustainable, current position of developed countries. And NCQG is feasible. When we compare it to other expenditure, it is not large. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much for unpacking those numbers, Igor. When I think about what you just said, I think one of the most crucial things is when it comes to meeting the NCQG targets, the ambitious targets that we've outlaid here, yes, we can. We can do it. It is possible. I would like to invite you, before we go to some questions from the audience, I would like you to invite you to applaud this brilliant panel that we've just had with us. So we have a few minutes for questions, and we do have some roving mics. And if you put your hand up, the mic can come to you. For you, and then next. Here we come. And if you can say your name and what organization you're with, that would be great too.
Thank you very much. My name is Patrick Catello. I'm the executive director of PASIDA. PASIDA is a local organization and international organization in Ethiopia. Local in my country because I'm a Kenyan, and international in Ethiopia. I'm the executive director We work among the pastoralist community of Northern Kenya. These are people who are seriously challenged by discussion in point. Of course, they are not the cause of the problem, but their great impact is right on them. In the last many years, we've been countering a series of droughts, series of floods, locusts in the last 100 years, and many other challenges, including COVID-19, which impacted globally. Now, this species of communities living in northern Kenya, southern Ethiopia, and Horn of Africa are at threat because they have virtually lost their livelihood. They have lost everything. Their lives and livelihood is in their livestock. 80% of their livelihood is driven from there. They don't do farming. They live in the most remote part of the world, with the largest desert found in their region. To this, they are literally becoming environmental refugees completely. Sedentarialized, with no any option to livelihood. In the last drought, which we never experienced in the last 40 years, they have virtually lost everything, including camels, which we claim to be proud to be saying is the sheep of the desert, succumb 90% to the last drought. I have been attending this kind of conference for the last five consecutive times of all COPs. But eventually, I realized very minimal what is coming out for these people who are seriously affected and challenged. I am seriously perturbed. What can I carry home from here? All the time, those are hard questions in my mind. Very little impact, very little trickles down to them. We don't walk the talk. We are just saying, and everything will remain here. How best can we support these people? How best can we keep their life back to normal? You can't bring pastoralists to this conference, or you can't take them to Washington. That is not an admirable life for them. Where they are comfortable, but their conducive environment has been challenged because of this impact of climate change, which has been caused, and the immersion is really impacting on them. What can we do? These are hard questions, and we need to pick up and ensure that we give a lasting solution to this kind of, we can't keep on, we are tired. Yeah. We are really tired of always talking the same thing in such conferences, and we must now go down to the ground and see how best we can support affected populations.
Thank you. We have a couple of other people. We have short amount of time. Thank you so much for that intervention. And let's try to get also some age and gender diversity after the speaker. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you so
Maybe
much.
you could keep it short because we only have about 10 minutes. Thank you.
I'm just getting the speed. My name is Azmat Khan, and I'm working with a local NGO FRD in Pakistan, and like amplifying the voices of Dr. Farah that not just Pakistan, the entire global South need grants, not loans, because these loans have made us even more miserable, and they have like deprived us of our resilience. One thing on the ODI presentation, specifically talking about the historical point, yes, you fix it 90s or 1850s or whatever, but if we really want the climate justice, the real justice thing, some factor for colonialism needs to be included in that calculation. The thing is, like, if the global South is suffering, yes, climate change is a thing, climate change and the emission and the greenhouse gases, but the inherent ability of those societies has been taken away during the colonial time by looting their resources. And in a COP where many of the governments are withdrawing from the climate discussions and the climate financing things, this is the time that the citizens of those developed and rich countries stand up just on the basis of the climate justice. Many governments have this excuse that we would have loved to contribute, but we have to answer the electorate. And the electorate, now it is the time for the citizens of those countries to tell their government that, yes, We have messed up the world with our emissions and the climate change we have caused, and let's take some responsibility for our action as nations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Debbie, I see you have your hand up. Did you want to ask? No, you thought you, okay, Colin. At the very back.
Thank you for the brilliant arrangement on the NCQG. My question first is, would you be able to define climate financing, considering its newness and additionality, and considering its difference from OTA? First. Second is, given that based on the OECD report, it is being claimed that the developed countries has already surpassed their pledge of 100 billion per year in 2022. Considering this statement or position, how can we reflect the viability of financing NCQG as we are aspiring to, like the Ugandan girl who raised her passionate and powerful voice, resonating the conditions in the most climate vulnerable countries. I don't know, did I forget to introduce me? I'm Shah Abdul Sadi, working for the government of Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Question, I think there was a question at the back, right at the very back there. And I think then we'll have some rapid response from our panelists. Oh, one more. And oh my goodness.
Hi everyone, my name is Candida Silva. I work for a peace building organization called Search for Common Ground. We are trying to bridge the divide between climate and peace at this COP. And I was wondering regarding the NCQG, we look a lot at conflict affected countries and how finance reaches these countries, which is not a lot. And I was wondering for our panelists, maybe Leticia and Igor, if you had a look at specific numbers for specifically conflict affected countries and how finance should be allocated to them given their particular needs. I'm just wondering, maybe you don't have an answer, but yeah.
Okay, so maybe we can take one more question, but we're gonna have to leave exactly at 4:30. Unfortunately, we only have about 5 minutes left.
Thank you. So Colin McQuiston from Practical Action. Question to the lady from ODI is, what does she see as the major barriers to that burden sharing mechanism? So if we get a quantum out of COP29, what are going to be the barriers to actually effectively managing it so that we can hold host governments to account? And the gentleman from UNCTAD, you mentioned that you developed your approach based upon national development needs. So how did you actually calculate those? Was it just from national development plans, or did you look at the NDCs, for example? So did you look at the conditional elements of the NDCs? And how does that approach then bring in the things that Gloria highlighted, which is around the restorative, the rehabilitative costs of climate impact? It's fine looking at the development side, but what about the loss and damage side of the puzzle? Thank you.
Wow, that's a lot of questions to answer. And so I'm going to encourage the panel to be laser sharp. And, it's like basically an X post that way you have 120 or 320 characters. So I'll take it from, if you could start and then, or whoever, yeah, go ahead.
I will only, thank you very much. I'll let Leticia and Igor talk about some of the questions related to some of the questions were very specific to their presentations, but I do want to say that there is a lot of the comments that we heard, a lot of expectation and also sense of disappointment from previous COPs and how much progress we can make. I just want to say that that it's really important that the conversation continues. It is really, really important that we keep raising these questions and we keep pushing for those, and people get together and keep talking about those and reach some conclusions. Back in 2022, when at COP27, the loss and damage facility was announced, it was something prior to that. This was a topic that had never received traction. And now we have seen so much data around NCQD and why an ambitious NCQD is possible, that the money is out there, that the money is available, that it is needed, that mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage need to be accounted for in the NCQD. I think we just need to continue with the conversation. Over to you, Letizia.
Thank you very much, Farah. And thank you everyone for all the questions. Also happy to have discussion after this outside the room. So from Ethiopia, I hear you on what can I carry home from here? And I think this is also a shared feeling among the room. I think that in technical term, it's about operationalization that could be through enhanced local access so that it is easier and faster to access climate finance for communities, whatever livelihoods they derive. And then about implementation to ensure that it does happen. It's about CSOs relaying that message. And that's, for example, the work that the coalition, Mercy Corp, et cetera, do. About the definition on climate finance versus ODA, you may be aware there is obviously a track and this negotiation about what is climate finance and its definition has been ongoing for years. So this should not hold us off from progressing on the NCQG. I think that the answer is to ask for stronger transparency arrangements and greater accountability so that we can clearly understand what is reported. On finance allocation to FCAS, so fragile and conflict affected states, again, I would say it's about enhanced local access. Many regions, many most vulnerable countries such as SIDS, AOs, etc., do ask for finance allocation. It's not about pitting one against the other. It's about faster accreditation, easier, so that that can be supported. And last, about the barriers to a burden sharing arrangement. I think the issue is that climate finance negotiators in the room may come from the Ministry of Environment, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, then they come back home and they tell the Treasury, I just agreed to 10 billion. And the Treasury just looks at them very sternly. And obviously there is a lot of domestic political economy there to unpack, not to mention electoral cycles that then may derail this. So I think these are the main barriers. Thank you very much. I will pass on to Gloria.
Okay, we have about 30 seconds left, so this is our wrap up. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. From the Q&A session we have had, I didn't get any question, but maybe to amplify my voice more is there is nothing for us without us. It's high time we make the new collective quantified goal more gender transformative and make finance accessible and flexible to young people. Thank you very much.
And just in 30 seconds, defining climate finance has been a big task for years, and we still don't have an official one. The easy part is that it cannot be at the commercial rates. Otherwise, then you just go on the international markets and you get finance. So it's finance if it's on commercial. So it has to be either grants or highly concessional. The tricky part is the additionality and how to distinguish from other forms of official development assistance and so on and so forth. But that's a big discussion. Let me just say a couple of words. We don't do specific countries in the global policy model for this exercise, but we do plan for next year to see in a small set of larger developing countries, what would NCQG, what would the needs be? So we hope to produce something for the next COP around that lines. And the restorative costs we do not have in the model because you don't have data on that. And modeling something without data is impossible. So you either have to have a proxy, which gives you some idea where you're heading, or the good data like we have for most macroeconomic variables, or the qualitative elements which cannot easily be transformed into data for the modeling. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everyone.